Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I go over my fifth and final round game in the Marshall Premier. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I drew another game against a Grandmaster, against Grandmaster Jurbek Kamrakulov, and it was a pretty good fighting game in the Nimzo Indian, where I put some pressure on him, but was not truly able to get one of these decisive advantages, and the logical outcome of a well-played game is a draw. Now, what happened in the fifth round, in the final round, was actually quite peculiar because I'd actually already played all the other opponents in this weekender that were higher rated than me. So by playing in round 4, GM Jurbek Kamrakulov, by playing Brandon Jacobson in round 3, and Grandmaster Mark Paragua in round 2, I'd actually already played all the high-rated players, and so it was a weird situation where even though I was still tied for first, I actually was going to be playing down. And so this actually gave me a huge opportunity to, basically remain in first place and at least get shared first with a victory. So I was really intent on, beating the person that was going to be in front of me, and I knew that I should be favored. And I knew I was going to be black, but it didn't matter. I was kind of determined to kind of go for it in this game. Now, my opponent, untitled as he was having a really great tournament himself. So even though he was lower rated and really untitled player, not even, I don't think, 2,000 Fide, I knew that it's not someone I should take lightly, especially because in the U.S., a lot of the times you wind up playing opponents that have low Fide ratings, and it's not because they're necessarily at that level. It's just because there aren't Fide rated tournaments all over the place that give them the opportunity to prove themselves in that way. So that's why in America, a lot of the times you'll have national ratings that are 200 points different or higher than the actual Fide rating. And that's something that, many players have a gripe with, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, so I was black in this one against an individual by the name of Matthew Masino, and he's someone that I've actually seen around the Marshall quite a bit. He is quite an active player and works a full-time job, but is also working on his game and making some strides. So kudos to him. So I knew it was not going to be an easy one, but without further ado, let's get into it. So Matthew opened with D4. And I played E6, which was actually kind of the trick of the trade in this event, where I was pretty much playing E6 regardless of how my opponent was playing. I was inviting the French. And it's actually kind of interesting because in all of the black games I faced in this event, 1 D4 came on the board. So I always played 1 E6. But it's interesting. There was a lot of D4 players at this tournament. So after E6, White actually went knight f3, did not take me up on the challenge of playing a French. And this is natural. I mean, usually when someone is a d4 player, they don't want to just switch to e4. And, there's some bravery in actually taking up the gauntlet. So, kudos to Brandon Jacobson in an earlier round for doing that. Youngsters tend to have a lot more bravery than the rest of us. We can debate whether it's bravery or foolishness, but it is what it is. Anyways, after knight f3, I went knight f6, and then e3 was played. And this move really, really surprised me, but it also kind of basically communicated to me pretty much what his game plan was, because e3 is a relatively modest system, so I thought. So I thought that this system really suggested a lack of ambition in some ways, because if you're really, really going for it, you should be playing c4 in this position, trying to take more space in the center, transpose to some main lines in that direction. And I've played a lot of e3 myself, but, e3 is not the move that has the most bite. So I was curious what he was going for in the setup, and it seemed to me that he's probably trying to be solid. Little did I know that he had some really concrete ideas with e3 that were not particularly solid, so stay tuned for those. So anyways, after e3, I went d5, bishop d3, and bishop e7. And this is actually a wrinkle that I've played before. I had a game at the Reykjavik Open this year where someone tried this e3, bishop d3 type of setup. And to avoid it being completely symmetrical, I like this bishop e7 move. And the reason for that is that in many lines, when c4 comes on the board or c5 comes on the board and there's this pawn tension in the middle, the bishop is actually in the way of the heavy pieces communicating with the central pawns. So the reason I like the bishop on e7 is that it's a little bit more defensive, yes, but it's not in the way of exchanges or pawn tensions that exist on the D and C files, and that's why I thought this is a nice nuance. And then, of course, there's the added benefit of not being totally symmetrical, so, whatever happens, we're not going to get this kind of position where white is, permanently a tempo up in a position where, it's very drawish. So a nice way to kind of imbalance the position just a touch. So anyways, after bishop b7, white played knight bd2. I did not really see the merits of delaying castling, but at least it seemed to me that here he was trying to go for some type of reverse semi-Slav, or I think it's the Korley system it's called, where you put the knight on d2, the bishop on d3, and you get some type of reverse setup. And here I actually started to see, okay, there is some potential of him jumping a knight on e5, maybe reinforcing with the knight on d2, and just getting an interesting position. So at least he was not, playing the safest moves in this respect, because castling to me would be the safest move. So it's interesting, with every move you start to pick up just a little bit more intel, and that's important because, again, we don't really have a chance to prepare for these games. In a lot of these weekender type of events in the US, you get the pairings literally 2 or 3 minutes before the game. So, every move I was picking up a little bit more information about what his intentions were. So anyways, after knight bd2, I castled. Why not? And now white played knight e5. And here I started to understand, he is actually playing quite ambitiously, because he has the bishop trained against h7. The knight has now kind of cheated in a way in terms of breaking, basic chess rules and not moving a piece twice in the opening. And the reason he's moving it twice in the opening is to kind of get some initiative going on the king side. So this basically told me he was probably going to go for f4 and try to cement that knight on e5 and get some counterplay going really quickly. Now, this actually made me feel quite good about putting the bishop on e7, because in some lines where the bishop is on d6, when f4 comes, it's very difficult to dislodge the knight on e5, because a lot of times there's some recapture where if I go knight d7 and knight takes e5, there's a recapture with f takes e5 or d takes e5, and then there's just a skewer on my minor pieces. But with my bishop on e7, if I do elect to take on e5 at some point, there's no such skewer. So that was another thing that I felt pretty good about having the bishop on e7 here. But after knight e5, I could see there's some storm clouds brewing on the king side, and I have to be quick to get counterplay on the queen side. So after knight e5, I went for c5, right? When someone is initiating play on the flank, and I know you might say, well, he's putting a knight in the center, but he's really beginning to initiate play on the flank. I wanted to counterattack in the center, and so that's what I was trying to do. White now played c3, which is normal. You want to set up this Korley-esque triangle pawn structure to preserve the bishop on this diagonal. And now I went actually c4. And this move is extremely controversial, because you might say, well, isn't it valuable to keep the tension in the center so that it doesn't become a serious race? Well, I agreed that, keeping the tension was playable, but I had a very specific idea in mind, in which I thought that if I play c4, I'm pretty much going to try and attack the white pawn chain on the queen side extremely quickly. And my rationale was that the reason this is justified is because I'm actually getting a tempo on this bishop on d3. So I thought if I very quickly can play c4 and then b5, it's unlikely that white's attack would crash through before my pawn storm would crash through, particularly with my king already being castled. So I thought that I just made a judgment call that it was unlikely that the attack would work for white and that I could be faster, and that was kind of what I figured. The other thing is I thought that at any moment I could try to trade some pieces with the knight on e5, even though it might not be desirable. I saw scenarios where I could potentially take on e5, and then if need be, sometimes throw a knight on e4 to block this diagonal. And so I just kind of felt that the attack shouldn't work. And if there's anything that computers have taught me about attacks in general in this, well, at least before Alpha Zero in this particular generation of computer analysis, it's that, defensive resources are almost always there in abundance. And quite frankly, attacks are actually very, very difficult to execute properly and efficiently. And so, typically there's a way to defend. And so just having that understanding that there's usually a way to defend gave me the confidence to go for this, even though it feels on the face of it to be quite risky. So anyways, after c4, bishop c2 was played. An argument could be made for bishop b1. I don't think it's a better move, but in some positions you might say, well, wouldn't it be better to have the queen on c2 and to have this battery like so? Again, the thing is at some point I might consider playing b5, bishop b7, and just putting a knight on e4. And what that would do is that would blunt this diagonal. So, I mean, again, an argument could be made for bishop b1, but I would not agree with that argument. I'm just pointing it out. So anyways, bishop c2. Now I went b5, pressing onward with my initiative. Again, that was the plan all along, to storm the queen side. And now white went f4, continuing with operations on the king side and in the center. And yeah, white can be quite fast. I mean, g4, g5 becomes an option just to dislodge my knight. Queen f3, queen h3 is another idea. So it is kind of, tricky to contend with. But I thought that if worse comes to worse, again, I can always put a knight on e4 once my bishop is on b7 and kind of blunt the pressure of this light squared bishop. And that's really where the crux of the attack is going to crash through, if it does, is with the bishop on c2 staying alive. So I felt I had reasonable play here. So anyways, after f4, I did go bishop b7, and I'm eyeing that e4 square already. And now white went queen f3, which I think is a good move and consistent with the strategy of trying to control the e4 square and get this attack going. Because if you actually insist on playing castles, there might be a world where I actually throw in knight e4 myself. And yeah, it actually is quite compelling, because if you take on e4, all of a sudden there's no initiative on h7 anymore, and it's difficult to get a second attacker on the e4 pawn. So I'm not arguing that this is the best way to play for black. I'm just pointing out that, the queen on f3 at least prevents that from happening. So after queen f3, I went knight bd7 now, developing this knight. I really wanted to go b4, but I thought it just doesn't work here because my bishop on b7 is unprotected. So that actually invites knight takes c4. I'm not sure which knight is more effective. Probably the d knight. And again, d takes c4 does not work here because of queen takes b7. So I still got to be a little bit alert and, protect that bishop before pressing forward. So knight bd7 does that. After knight bd7, white castled. And now I played rook b8. And again, the point was that I would love to play b4, but I thought it was wise to protect my bishop first. Now, the computer actually points out, funnily enough, that I can play b4 right away. The point is that after knight d takes c4, I can actually take on c3, and after b takes c3, go rook c8. And the point is that I actually recover my pawn because the c pawn is also weak behind the knight on c4. So if we have an exchange on d7 and knight e5, now I can play bishop a6, challenge the rook on f1, and after the rook moves, go rook takes c3. And actually, I would contend that black's actually slightly better here because the material is equal, and white has some weaknesses to contend with, and the c file that's a little bit sensitive. And so black is for choice here, although this was a line that I really was not looking at too deeply because I didn't fully appreciate that I have rook c8 after knight takes c4. The other thing here is that there's also the move e4, trying to blast through in the center before I crash through on the queen side. And I could take on e4 and then go bishop d5. And black's actually quite good here because this pin is very annoying. And exchanges actually help me to a certain extent because white has more space in the center and is trying to attack. White isn't really interested in trading pieces. And if I trade pieces, I'm going to, get some more play on the queen side and not have to worry about my king. So this is not the type of line that white would actually want to go for, and this is why the computer kind of likes this. But I went rook b8. So after rook b8, white played a3, kind of trying to slow down my b4 break. And now I went a5, just kind of going for b4 anyway. And I fully recognized here there was a race. And, my king is the one being attacked, whereas I'm attacking the queen side where there isn't a king. But I just had this feeling that this attack shouldn't work. And so I kind of just kept that faith going. And, of course, it was also backed by some calculation, but I just didn't really see it. And so I just pressed onward on the queen side and kind of like almost was acting like a computer where I was like, well, do I see mate? Well, no. Okay, then I don't have to worry about it. So after a5, white now went g4, trying to press onward with the initiative on the king side. And g5 actually becomes, a very interesting and serious idea. Now, I actually went for b4, but one thing I was calculating was that if knight takes e5 and f takes e5, this seemed a little bit dangerous to me because I do get my knight to d7 where it has a safe haven, but after queen h3, g6 seemed very, very dangerous to me to have to play this and weaken some squares on this flank. And so I kind of thought, you know what, maybe that's not such a great idea. So after g4, I thought it's better to just press onward in the middle with b4, even though knight takes e5 was playable. So after b4, a takes b4 is played. And then I played a takes b4. And this actually kind of, it helps black to, get this b4 break in. But, you can also see the reason why white played a3. Because now this rook on a1 that was kind of a sleeping beauty at least has some play on the a file. So that was actually the merit of white actually playing a3 so that the rook on a1 gets in the game without even moving. Although you can see that the a file's not exactly, rosy right now. It's not like there's any square that the rook really wants to go to where it's doing anything too significant. And one other thing is the a file could be an asset for me. So at some point I might just try to go rook a8 and actually take over the a file and push white back there. So I thought that it was an interesting choice, but it also gave black some opportunities. So anyways, after a takes b4, white now went queen h3. And again, you could see there's a now serious threat with g5 and just queen takes h7 mate. So I have to be extremely, extremely alert. I started with the move b3. I thought this was a very, very important move. And after this move, I felt pretty comfortable with my position. And the reason for that is I thought that now with the pawns being so far advanced, and particularly this b3 pawn, I thought that endgames for me would be extremely favorable because my advanced pawn is always close to queening and, essentially the pawn in front of it that's blocking it is always going to be kind of weak and become a target. So after b3 and, bishop b1, the only move to stay on that diagonal, I felt really, really good about my chances in the endgame. The other thing now is that the rooks for f1 and a1 just aren't getting connected because the bishop is insistent on staying here. So I thought, you know what, if I'm able to weather the next 5 moves or so, I'm going to be in really great shape because if the attack doesn't crash through, white's actually kind of undeveloped given the state of his bishops. So anyways, after bishop b1, I now played g6. And I thought here that there are a few pieces in the area that are attacking my king. There's the queen on h3, the knight on e5, the rook on f1, and maybe the bishop on b1. But I thought with g6, I'm blocking out one of those pieces, the bishop on b1. And a lot of times with attacks, you can actually just count the pieces in the area. And so if you count the attackers, there are 4 attackers. But if you count the defenders, I pretty much have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 defenders in the area. And so I thought that if you just do that material count, it doesn't seem like there's any attack that's going to crash through right now. And again, I always have the option of sticking a knight on e4 and shutting down the diagonal completely. So I felt that there was just no attack here. And I was kind of right. I mean, after g6, white played f5, trying to crash through now, but that's actually a sign that the natural move g5 is probably not very effective. Because if you go g5, I can consider playing knight h5 and shutting down the h file for a time. I can also consider playing knight e4 and blocking things up a little bit. I can even consider knight e8 and then jumping to d6 and maybe to f5. Maybe that's even a nice relocation. But either way, it doesn't seem like there's a mate, and that's the important difference. So after g6, f5 was played, and this is critical because it would appear that a sacrifice on g6 is kind of inevitable with that pawn eyeing it, the knight eyeing it, and the bishop eyeing it. But the reason I didn't like f5 was because I thought the knight on e5 actually was kind of sensitive now, because in a lot of the previous positions, whenever I played knight takes e5, it was going to be f takes e5 that was played. But now with the pawn going to f5, it just seemed like the knight on e5 lacked a little bit of reinforcement. And so after f5, I first played e takes f5, but after g takes f5, now I actually played knight takes e5, and it seems super counterintuitive to, invite this d takes e5 and both these menacing pawns on the fifth rank. But the point is that I'm getting rid of an attacking piece that was in the neighborhood of my king, and that after this exchange, now the pawn structure is a little bit fragmented. But it's all about timing here, because if the knight got to d4 very quickly, then I wouldn't be so happy with that situation, because my bishop would not have play. So I actually thought it was all about timing, and I thought the timing kind of worked out for me. Because after d takes e5, now I played knight h5, and this position already is quite tricky. White played f6 trying to shut things down, but I think one of the things that's kind of important to point out is that if you play a move like knight f3, it appears like this knight is coming to d4 and everything is all roses and peachy, but actually I think black's for choice here, because there are a few options that take advantage of the e-pawn being a little bit weak. So one option might actually be just bishop c5. And the point is that if the knight comes to d4, again, there's only two pieces on g6 right now, so it's not the biggest problem in the world. And I can consider moves like queen e7 or rook e8. So maybe even better than playing bishop c5 right away would actually be to start with queen c7. And the point is that if the knight comes to d4, I can take on e5 and kind of stabilize. So I thought that in these types of positions, it doesn't seem like there's a huge breakthrough. Now, in some lines, e6 might be a little bit dangerous because you're putting pressure on the base of my pawn chain, which is f7 or h7, but really f7 here just is more relevant because it's touching my king. And that's some e6 thrust would be something I'd have to worry about a little bit. So knight f3, maybe the e6 becomes into play. But again, I just wasn't completely convinced that there was enough here. And it turned out my instincts were actually right, because there really wasn't. When I analyzed the position, black was actually doing quite fine, even at this juncture. Anyways, after f6 was played, I actually thought this was almost a slight mistake, because it did kind of release the tension on this diagonal. And what that did is it meant that I don't have to worry about sacrifices on g6 anymore. And so I thought this actually was a really nice transition for me. And once these pawns become static, I thought that I could start to take over a little bit. So after f6, I played bishop c5, and now knight f3 was played, but I just played the move rook e8. And here you could see that e6 seems to be pretty much halted for now, and the knight coming to d4 actually just blunders the e5 pawn. So it seems like my pieces are all doing reasonable jobs here, and even in some lines I could consider a move like bishop c8, relocating the bishop if I feel it's not effective on this diagonal. But basically I had two kind of short to long-term plans here. One was to potentially sacrifice an exchange on e5, because I thought that as long as these bishops are on c1 and b1 and don't have any squares, note again, this bishop does not have any squares on this diagonal anymore, and this bishop on c1 has one square. I thought that exchange sacrifice on e5 would be quite attractive, because once e5 drops, f6 drops, and e3 becomes a target. So that was one idea. The other idea in certain lines was to move the queen off the 8th rank and then actually go rook a8 and trade the rooks. Because if I actually trade a pair of rooks, I can actually threaten rook a1 myself. And if I get my rook to a1 where white's rook is, I think white's position collapses, because again, this bishop on b1 isn't very secure. the last thing, of course, that would be very, very nice in positions like this is just to trade queens, because if the queens come off the board, white simply has no real checkmating attack, and that's the only reason. That's the only way that white can really win the game with a mangled pawn structure like this. So again, it's kind of just weathering this intermediate short-term storm, and then, black usually survives. So after rook e8, it's actually already a very, very critical position because of some of the ideas I was pointing out. And amazingly here, there is one remaining resource that kind of beats back at some of the plans I was talking about and kind of forces tactics. So why don't you pause the video, because this is a resource that is really, really important for white to play if he wants any chances, because after this it kind of goes downhill. So even though white didn't play this, I think it's important to kind of try and figure out how to continue to play energetically here when you're strategically worse. So white to play. All right, hopefully you pause the video and we're able to figure out maybe what white could do to keep this initiative going that he was trying to manufacture. The move, believe it or not, is actually bishop f5. And the idea is that you have to be insistent about continuing the initiative here. And the immediate g takes h5 or g takes f5 is terrible because the knight hangs, and then there's all types of threats with queen g5 and queen g7 mate, or knight g5 and queen takes h5, h7 mate. So I can't take the bishop on f5. And I actually saw this move, but I still thought that, this shouldn't work because e6 is still relatively under my control. And I thought I had two viable options here. There was one that was fairly, standard and kind of, controlled. And then there was one that was quite spectacular. So the first idea here is I can actually just go queen b6. And I thought that here I'm simultaneously attacking e3, but I'm also guarding e6, overprotecting that square. It actually turns out that e6 can still be played here, and I thought it was probably not going to work, but white can still actually fight here. And after this exchange on e3, I actually have to worry about e takes f7 check. So I actually have to play knight f4, and after some crazy lines, I actually get a position where I'm actually in exchange down, but I have enough pawns to hold, and the computer's evaluating this as equal, but I actually think it's kind of anybody's game because my pawn on b3 is so far advanced that it could be dangerous if my rook on b8 ever got a file. So if it shifted over to the f file, that might be something. I can also put my bishop on e4 and pretty much never lose in scenarios like that because my bishop is so strong there and my king would be safe. And who knows, maybe there's some lines where my king can even run in and try to get to the pawns that way. But objectively, this position is probably closer to a draw than a win for black or white, but I think that practically speaking, it would be more difficult for white to play. Another way to play, and this is actually the way I was actually calculating after bishop f5, was actually the move knight takes f6, just giving up a piece. And the reason I was actually strongly considering this line, even though I only get 2 pawns for the piece, is just because of positional grounds. The bishop on c1 is actually really, really poor piece, and the rooks aren't connected. So I thought that, given my coordination, this is something that's fairly justifiable, and it turns out that it is. Now, the interesting thing is that after bishop d7, which is the computer move here, the computer actually is interested in playing rook takes e3, which was not a move I was strongly considering, because this position, I'm giving up a whole rook now because I already gave up a piece, and this position actually becomes, quite off the rails, but actually favorable for black. Actually, after bishop takes e3 in this position, and king g2, after d4, it's actually black that's completely winning because the bishops cut through the position with decisive effect. In fact, it almost reminds me of my brilliancy against Moisenko from Extracon Open, because you could just see how the bishops are incredible and the king is really safe here. And now the pawns actually become a factor. Essentially, after c takes d4, bishop takes d4, these passed pawns actually become very, very dangerous, and it's a big reason why black is winning here, is because once b2 drops, these are connected passers that are very close to queening. So very, very serious concept that really turns the game on its head. And you can see rook d1 is quite a spectacular move, but that wins the game, but just amazing tactics and fireworks that come out of sacrificing the piece. Now, remarkably, after this bishop d7 and rook takes e3 move, the best move is actually knight d4, and I think that kind of signals just how important it is just to keep these bishops under lock and key, because now the bishop is stuck behind d5 for now, and this bishop is being locked down that way, and we have a position where black essentially gets 3 pawns for the piece, but at least white has some control of my bishop, so it's not, losing. It's a very playable position that's close to equal. So very, very fascinating line, but not something that my opponent strongly considered, because I spoke to him after the game. He didn't really consider bishop f5, but I actually thought it was kind of his only way to stay in the game, and it actually turned out that my instincts were correct, because after the move that white played, queen h4, the cookie basically began to crumble. The reason for that is that queen h4 doesn't really threaten anything, and now I actually am able to play this very important move, queen d7, which actually does several jobs. So one thing it does is it connects my rooks, which is fantastic. The other thing it does is it actually covers the e6 square, and the last thing it does is it entertains, creeping out towards the king side at some juncture on g4. So all of a sudden, all my pieces are, really at work and, quite synchronized, and that's not really the case for white's pieces. Again, this bishop is still stuck on c1. The bishop on b1 has no squares. The rook on a1, even though it's on an open file, actually only has the a5 square, and how good is that? And this queen, even if it gets to h6, could just be parried with bishop f8. Or actually the knight's just covering g7. So there's no way into the black king, and that pretty much, spells white's doom, because positionally here, black is in the driver's seat. So after queen d7, white actually played rook d1 here, and was extremely low on time, because it's difficult to try to find, attacking ideas when there aren't any. And white was trying in vain to keep the initiative going, but it just wasn't there. So rook d1 was played, and here this move actually allows a nice shot that is not so difficult to see when I had as much time as I had. So I thought for about 10 minutes or so, and then played the remarkable but working d4. And all of a sudden, the floodgates open for both of my bishops, because the natural captures on d4 with the pawns don't work, because the knight on f3 is hanging. And the point is that if you go like e takes d4, bishop takes f3, not only do I pick up this knight, now the rook on d1 is hanging, so you can't actually recover your piece by taking on c5. And so because of d4, the position just collapses. So after d4, white actually played knight takes d4, but the issue with taking with the knight, even though it was the most viable piece to capture with, is that now I can take on e5, and all of these pawns drop when e5 drops. So I played rook takes e5, and it's just a huge problem, because now these bishops are roaming free. The knight's actually pinned. And you can just see it's actually very few pieces that white can actually move. Even with a board full of pieces, both of these bishops, again, are terrible. Rook on a1 lacks entry squares because of these bishops. Knight on d4 pin. So it's just a huge problem. So after rook takes e5, white went rook f1, getting out of that pin. And I just went rook a e8, doubling and, essentially putting more pressure on e3. And I have so many threats here. I can sack on e3 if I want, but really the idea of rook a8 was to follow up with queen d5, introduce battery mates on g2, because now that my rooks are doubled, I can actually sack the exchange with rook takes e4 if white blocks with pawn e4. So that was the idea there. So after rook b e8, white played knight f3, trying to challenge this rook, and now the sacrifice is begging to be played, so I went for it with rook takes e3. And it's very important to keep these bishops on the board, because if I take here, this is effective, but it just also does not win very cleanly. Now this diagonal is actually kind of secure for the white king, so I don't have any decisive breakthrough right away. Whereas by taking with the rook, this bishop is actually hugely effective, because now the king is not safe on either color complex because of both of my bishops. So after rook takes e3, bishop takes e3 is played. And now I went bishop takes e3 check, and you can just see that come to life. Both of these bishops are just so powerful. And again, I sound a little bit like a broken record, but this bishop on b1 still doesn't have any squares. So even if somehow I traded queens here and the queens were off the board, black would still be winning by virtue of how advanced these pawns are and just how poor the coordination of white's remaining pieces would be. But after king h1, I can, force matters, and so I went bishop takes f3, rook takes f3, and now queen d1 check, and it's pretty much curtains because I can, take things with check. So after king g2, I went queen e2 check, and now rook f2 is forced if you want to continue. I took that, another forcing move, queen takes f2, and now I went knight f4 check, and finally, after knight f4, my opponent resigned, because if you continue here, if you go king g1, knight h3 check just forks the king and queen. And, of course, if you come up to g3, protecting the queen, I can just throw in rook e3 check. And fortunately for me, these captures comes with check, so rook a8 mate does not get to be played, because after queen takes e3, queen takes e3 is another check, king g4, for instance. I could play h5 check, and basically the mate comes with checks. If king h4, there's knight g2 mate. If king g5, there's also knight g2 mate, which is a very pretty discovery mate covering all these squares. But yeah, that's pretty much what it is. So after knight f4 check, my opponent resigned, and I tied for first in the September Marshall Premier. So it was a weekend event, 5 rounds, but I'm still pretty happy with it, because I actually managed to play up 3 times. I played 2 GMs, and I picked up a few waiting points and, a little bit of money. So successful weekend Fide event. So, this is what, I can do. There's one a month at the Marshall. So if I'm in the city and I'm not playing a tournament somewhere else, it's a good way to kind of test your skills a little bit and stay local, and yeah, just, keep improving. So, again, the road to Grandmaster is, of course, I want 3 GM norms, but you also need the 2500 rating, and the rating is just as difficult, or dare I say even harder than the norms to a certain extent, because while the GM norm is about being extraordinary, the 2500 rating is about consistency over a period of time, and that's something that I need to certainly wrestle with, improve on, etc., etc. So showing that consistency is really what will get me there if I get there. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.